So hello, everyone. Welcome to Bias in the Media and You. So we are going to be talking about conversations about biased media, and we may bring up some political and difficult topics. So we're definitely going to try to have the most respectful discourse and conversation. Nothing too heavy, but just wanted to bring that up. And just to introduce ourselves, my name is Jessica Keebler. I am the Instructional Services Librarian at the Mortola Library, and I'm presenting with...
Yes, I'm Megan McGivney. I'm the English adjunct professor at New York City campus. I'm also a freelance journalist.
So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk about what bias is as a definition, who holds bias, what are some strategies for navigating it in the media, and examples of bias in the media. So what is bias? So bias can show up in any part of our lives. It's a preference or an inclination, especially one that inhibits impartial judgment. So when interacting with the media, our bias can show up as we bring our identities to our evaluations of sources and information. So being aware of our biases and how they show up is essential in this time where we're just inundated with information. Let's say someone here, maybe me, maybe not, is biased towards Star Wars because it's a better series than Game of Thrones, for example. There's entire YouTube pages that are dedicated to comparing books versus movies, different book series versus other series. We're human and we like to categorize things. So this is a low stakes example of bias, but it can be extrapolated into all types of bias. And so here's two quick political examples. So this first one is an example from a cartoon, a political cartoon. It's someone from the liberal media polls going to someone and asking, do you think President Obama is doing a great job, a wonderful job, or an absolutely terrific job? So that was probably either posted in a newspaper or online somewhere. And then this is a real example from Donald Trump's official campaign survey. It says, should President Trump and his campaign do more to hold the fake news media accountable? So it is fair if he wants to include that on his personal campaign survey, sure. But if we're talking about bias, that's definitely an example of a question that is designed to sway people in one direction. So those are some bias examples. So what's news bias? So news bias is when assumptions and opinions favoring one side are reported in a skewed way. So this is the type of bias that we're mostly going to talk about today. So I find that this way of thinking is helpful in a lot of ways in terms of thinking about bias on a spectrum, not a binary, because we are all biased and we bring that to the way that we read the news. You know, liberals and conservatives can see the same news coverage, maybe not one story, but coverage in general, and see contradicting biases in those pieces. So we need to allow ourselves to recognize our bias and factor that into our critical thinking about information. We also need to know that journalists have blind spots at times. You know, editors can catch sometimes things that happen, but that doesn't mean that coverage that is mildly biased is intentionally that way. It means, you know, we're all human, right? Even journalists are human. We have to recognize that it's really hard, especially now in times of turmoil, to have complete objectivity. It is the goal, and it is in the journalistic code of ethics, but sometimes news will fall short. Does that mean that we accept completely overt, obvious, continuous bias over and over again? No. We continue to evaluate the sources and we limit our engagement with the ones that are consistently not following those journalistic ethics, including, you know, just at least trying for objectivity. And we also can acknowledge that a single instance of biased reporting doesn't diminish a long reputation of quality reporting. Would you agree, Megan?
Mm-hmm, definitely.
All right, so sometimes the skeptic could say it's all biased, but we want to remember that it is a spectrum. It's not all biased.
Yeah, I just want to add that, saying something is all biased, it's like, you probably mentioned this before, is painting something very broadly with the same brush, really. And it's also kind of being cynical towards news in general, saying, oh, all news is biased. It's like you're giving up too soon, too quickly, without really looking at what is out there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
So how does this bias show up? What does it look like? There are many ways and many types of biases, even though most people think of the first one here, they mostly think of partisan political bias. But bias can be really nuanced and based on context, which is why a lot of people kind of prefer to stick with that binary yes or no, rather than really learning about the various ways that it can show up. So there's partisan bias, there's demographic bias. So maybe the way a journalist covers it based on who they cover, who they quote. Are they only quoting either men or women or white men, or are they only quoting people from a certain background? Corporate bias, does someone, some company own that news source and so they're not reporting on them? Neutrality bias or false balance. So it's 50-50 coverage on a topic where there's really a consensus of truth. So for example, climate change, if a news organization had on a climate denier in the same conversation as someone, as a scientist who is promoting how to change global warming, that would be a false balance. And then big story bias. So if they're really just trying to get the scoop, they're not concerned about the truth in the conversation. And that's the issue with, that's an issue since that binary way of thinking that we just talked about really leads to that deep cynicism that Megan was talking about, that everybody's trying to manipulate me, so why should I pay attention? But we know it's important to pay attention. So understanding that these types of biases exist is one step towards understanding and not becoming cynical. Mm-hmm. So here are some examples that I borrowed from the News Literacy Project. They did a great webinar on these types of biases. So this first scenario, let's say a journalist spends most of his time in the city, but he travels to a rural community to report on an environmental hazard. And he describes the community as a simple, God-fearing slice of America. So what type of bias do we think that is?
It's more of a bias against people who don't live in a certain demographic or a certain area, because he doesn't really see them as, well, anything outside of his personal stereotypes.
Yep, exactly. Demographic bias. So this second one is about a social media manager at a national newspaper posts a story about UN climate change report. So that the coverage isn't perceived as bias, she posts a graphic with this caption, "Is climate change man-made? Click here to find out." But the report's findings present overwhelming evidence that climate change is, in fact, the result of human activity. So which one is that one?
50-50?
Yes, right, the 50-50, the false balance. So just in order to try to not be biased, they're actually being biased because they're trying to put in two sides that are not equivalent. All right, two more. So the missed story. Senior editors at a local news outlet decide that allegations of corruption by their publication's parent company are not newsworthy enough to warrant extensive coverage on the front page. What about that one?
The corporate bias.
Corporate bias. And this last one, it kind of answers itself, right? The media botched the Covington Catholic story. So I don't know if you guys remember this one from a couple of years ago. I think it was 2017, maybe. There was the students outside the Lincoln Memorial who were accused of harassing the group of Native American protesters. But it turns out that the story was a lot more nuanced and complex than people first noticed. And so he actually won a settlement against various news companies because of the way he was portrayed initially in the media. So there's a quote from this article from The Atlantic that says, how could the elite media, the New York Times, let's say, have protected themselves from this event, which has served to reinforce millions of Americans' beliefs that traditional journalistic outlets are purveyors of fake news? Among other things, journalistic ethics hold that if you don't have the reporting to support a story, and if that story has the potential to hurt its subjects, you don't run the story. And so that was this person's interpretation of this big story bias. They were just trying to run with it, and unfortunately it had some consequences. So that's a really big example of that. All right, so what are some strategies? We have a definition, but what are some ways that we can actually do that? Does anyone have any questions or comments so far?
Yeah, how do you know when to step back? Because sometimes you become a little scared to step back because you're scared of, if you say, hey, can I just step back from this and just like look at this from a more objective point of view, you might get backlash from someone you're covering or interviewing, because they might want to have you go their way instead of a more neutral ground. As
a journalist, you want to answer that, Megan?
Yeah. If I ever feel like I'm in a situation, I try to explain. I'm trying to show both sides of the issues. And another thing is, I think some people get, based on my experience, some people seem to confuse that journalists are publicists, and it's like I am not. And I really don't want to get to that point sometimes, but I have to explain. I'm not a publicist. This is my job. I'm not representing you. I'm representing. I'm telling the whole story here, both sides of the issue. So, and yeah, sometimes some people don't understand, and that creates problems.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. So that is one thing that makes a journalist's job difficult, really, is riding that line.
Mm-hmm.
Good question. All right, so first step is an easy one. Identify the opinion pieces. With so much information out there, we need to know, A, the difference between news and opinion. So news is information that informs through fair and impartial reporting. And opinion is information that presents a specific point of view. So with whatever we're looking at, whatever article, look for those key indicators of opinion. So does it say anywhere, like next to his name, he's an opinion contributor? Up above there, it says today's debate in the opinion section. So we want to be identifying which ones are opinion as opposed to straight objective news. And this is how they might show up on social media. A lot of people don't necessarily read their news directly from the websites. On Twitter, The Guardian does a great job of identifying their opinions. The Washington Post has analysis, but does that mean that it's supposed to be straight news, or is that supposed to be an opinion and they're using the word analysis? So you might want to click on that and actually see if it's in their opinion column. It can be a little misleading. And these opinion pieces are valuable because they're providing perspective that might not be provided or shouldn't be provided in a straight news source, but we need to be able to identify it to analyze it the right way.
I just want to add something. It's important that we read the analysis part. Remember, it's analysis.
Right.
Not a report.
Exactly. Analysis and report are very different. And this is an example of opinion as analysis, right? So this article title, you can definitely tell that it's a little bit biased sounding. This Republican governor just totally missed the point of the school reopening debate. It says analysis by Chris Salisa, and he has his own show on YouTube and his own column. So if you just went to this, it doesn't say opinion anywhere, does it? It just says analysis by. So we just have to remember that sometimes news will be portrayed in a certain way that's not entirely straight objective news. It can be misleading. So how else can we identify opinion pieces? Look for those words: opinion, commentary, editorial. Look for first person statements like I feel, or this is my perspective. And look for persuasive, sarcastic, emotional, exaggerating language. So one example might be considered the last one we looked at. It was a little bit sarcastic. And this is another example of that. Kayleigh McEnany has made a mockery of her promise not to lie. Tuesday's briefing was case in point. So this is on Vox, and it doesn't say anywhere that it's analysis or opinion. But we can use that last bullet point to keep in mind that this is really trying to sway us in one direction, and it's very opinionated. So a second one, are the headlines accurate and factual? Because this headline sounds very objective, which is good. DHS proposing time limits on international students and exchange visitors. But we want to read the article to get more facts. What are the time limits? Why are they being proposed? What are the consequences to students? So we do want to go further, but the headlines can act as kind of that first level indicator of objectivity. And then we have to go past the headlines. So we just looked a little while ago at some types of bias, including partisan bias, ideological bias, neutrality bias. So these are some questions you can ask yourself when trying to identify which bias it is. So read the article. It's a simple task, right? But there's too many articles, and that's where it becomes a problem. Or at the very least, read a few topic sentences. Read the first sentence of the first few paragraphs. Consider the types of biases that we talked about before when asking the questions. So who's writing the article? what does the source's other coverage look like? Is it a lot of different perspectives, or is it kind of the same ideological perspective? Whose voices are included? Is there that demographic bias or neutrality bias? And very important, is it a developing story? Because then that's the situations that could happen of accidental bias, if they're just trying to get all the facts, but they're not there yet. So let's look at some examples of looking past the headlines. So this article's headline focuses on the California governor's upcoming sales ban on gas vehicles, which are set to be phased out by 2035, so in 15 years. The article does define the basics of the ban, and that eventually people will only be able to buy gas cars on the used market, not new anymore. And this is from Fox News. It also really focuses on job loss, not at all on the benefits to the environment, which may have motivated the decision. And it talks a lot about the environmental groups who oppose it, and the oil and automotive groups that oppose it. I'm sorry, the environmental groups that support it, rather. But what else is going on in this story? Is this the entire story? So this is an article from Politico, a different type of headline. It's also not the most objective. So Newsom bans new gas cars and begs Trump for a fight. So it implies that gas cars are banned now rather than in 2035. It's kind of misleading. And it really just highlights his fight with Trump, which seems unnecessary to report the story. But that kind of goes back to what we talked about on day one in our first workshop, in which, news sites are looking for clicks. That is unfortunately a thing that's happening. So this might make someone click on it rather than just a straight headline about the news ban or the car ban. So their headlines are trying to grab you. But what does the article say? So if we look at the arrows, it does focus on Newsom's political fight with Trump, but it also does show a bit more balance in reporting than the Fox News article. And it shows more of the nuance and complexity of the situation. So it quotes a Republican saying that Democrats are overstepping, and it implies that all Democrats would agree with Newsom. But then it notes that even Joe Biden doesn't agree with the sales ban. So it's adding a little bit of nuance in who supports this ban. So not all Democrats support it. Whereas the Fox News article kind of implied that it was really just Democrats versus Republicans, which it isn't. It also notes why the spirit and the science behind the ban is important to the climate, especially in California. And an important note, it says that Ford is in favor of the ban and called out other car companies for not supporting more fuel-efficient solutions. So whereas the Fox article talked about, all automotive groups are against the ban, that's not true. Ford is actually in support of it. And Newsom actually signed it on the hood of a Ford. And just to point this out, because I thought it was interesting, this is a second iteration of the story on Politico with the same picture, same video, but it focuses on the ban and not on the partisan fight. So this headline is much more objective than the last one. And the article gives a lot more detail on the sales ban itself and California's struggle with economy and transportation and climate change. I don't know, Megan, why do you think that would be the case, that they would do two articles that look almost exactly the same but have different content? Is that like meeting the desires of the public for different information?
It could be. What time was each article published?
9:23 at 1:30 p.m. and 9:20. It says the same time. Oh no, wait. It says updated.
Okay.
9:05 p.m. So this one was actually updated later in the evening.
Well, I noticed the other one had California right above the headline. So I'm wondering,
was they both do?
Like, oh, they both do. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Which is interesting, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I'm wondering. That is a good question. Based on what I've seen, news sites will, when they get more information, they will change the article, maybe change the headline. Even the New York Times does the same thing. They'll like have different headlines for the same story at different times. That's trying to appeal to a certain audience at a certain time.
Right. Yeah, exactly. That's kind of what I was thinking too. So that's one story, 3 different ways, and how they're presented and the potential bias that you can see in the facts that they provide in the story. And again, I just pulled out information that I saw. You might even be able to get more information from reading the whole articles. So our 4th tip is to check and calm your emotions. Over the past few months, people have been pointing out the media coverage of COVID, claiming that reports are exaggerating the numbers to stoke fear. And it's completely logical to feel afraid and anxious during a pandemic, but these people are allowing their fear to determine how they view factual news. I mean, would people not want the numbers or potential dangers to be reported at all? You know, there's a lot of news and it's easy to feel overwhelmed, but we want to know what's happening, right? On the flip side, there's news sources that are using people's natural human reactions to elicit responses from readers to keep them reading or to push an agenda. You know, I'll be completely honest. The pictures I have up here is about my example. When I read stories about the COVID anti-mask lockdown protests, I get really angry, and I have since April. And each time I read a story, I try really hard to recognize why I have those emotions and that I need to just set those aside to understand the facts. So, you know, why are they protesting? What happened at this particular protest to warrant news coverage? But I don't fault the news for reporting it. They're reporting what's happening. And if they didn't cover it and they didn't know about it, I might not understand the true experience of that the country's having with the pandemic. So, so our emotions have to be in check a little bit when we're reading as well. So these are some questions to ask. You know, how is this making me feel? Angry, sad, probably not happy, but maybe. Are these emotions impacting how I'm engaging with this information? And am I just accepting this information or am I thinking about it critically? And so we don't want to be the confirmation bias guy where you're just clicking the first link that like kind of clicks with what you believe and that's what you're going to go with. Yeah. So, you know, I could just read a story that says, for me, right, thinking about that last example that you know, COVID is a hoax protest or a waste of time and logic. And I would say, yes, totally. That would be my confirmation bias. And I would continue being irritated, but I'd also have to recognize that it's confirming my emotions and investigate that and see what else is going on. And there's also disconfirmation bias, which we don't hear about as often, but that is when we're hypercritical of information that we don't want to hear. So for example, maybe the fact that those anti-lockdown protesters have their First Amendment right to protest might be something that I don't want to hear and I don't want to investigate. So if I allowed that disconfirmation bias to get the best of me, I might try to argue against it and find information that confirmed my belief, which wouldn't be right as well. So here's another way of looking at confirmation bias. This video is from facinghistory.org. So I pulled it from a video, which is why there's captions. So this is kind of a prevalent perspective these days, is when you're presented with overwhelming evidence and people just say, I don't believe you. I don't have the answer to solving this type of thinking, but we can be part of the solution by modeling critical thinking. All right, so now we're going to test our skills a little bit. I have some polls that I'm going to try to put up. So thank you, Megan, for this meme.
You're welcome.
Okay, so I have 3 headlines and we're going to put them in a row and I have a poll that'll pop up and I want you to just determine if there's any bias in the headline. So not that binary, is it bias, yes or no, but do you sense any? So let's see if the polls work. So did everybody see all of the polls at once?
Yep.
Do you see all 6? Okay, so just answer question number 1. So the headline is USS Theodore Roosevelt, commander relieved of duty. So is there any bias there or none at all?
No bias. It's just very much stating a fact.
Okay. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, so what about this one? Navy removes aircraft carrier captain who raised alarm about coronavirus concerns.
Not really, because it's still stating a fact.
Mm-hmm. Good.
Yeah,
All right,
it's not getting emotional either.
Mm-hmm. All right, last one. So the commander of aircraft carrier hit by coronavirus removed for poor judgment after sounding alarm.
There is, because it sort of implies a bias against the commander.
So in a second, I'll show you all of the, let me end the polling. I'm going to show each of the different sources that this came from. So I got this kind of mini activity from News Literacy Project. They did this in a webinar that I participated in, and I actually said the same thing, that the last one had the most bias. These are where the sources came from. And so according to the News Literacy Project, all of these are pretty objective because they're really just highlighting factual information from the sources. The poor judgment and sounding alarm are what came exactly from the report. It's quotes. So in that case, they're really just reporting what happened. And we didn't show the sources because those could actually inform what type of bias we feel is in the sources. But you had them right, that they were all pretty objective. So let's try a few more, but not just with headlines. We'll actually look at the articles themselves. Okay, so this would be for number 4. Is there bias in this headline? Or is there bias in this article altogether? Is it very biased, somewhat biased, objective, or opinion?
It's opinion because it says so right under New York Post. It says opinion.
Right, exactly. So you're looking for the factor there. There is that right in the right of the picture. So it says it's an opinion. We've identified that. That helps us with our analysis. Let's try another one. So Portland protests, Trump threatens to send officers to more U.S. cities, and there's a little bit of a blurb down there. So again, kind of on that spectrum, is it very biased, somewhat biased, objective, or opinion commentary?
Something's telling me it's like not objective, but somewhat biased, but I don't really know why. I'm guessing it's more like highlighting the officers. I'm not really sure.
I could see this one being tricky, right? Like technically it's what's happening, right? It was factual at the time that it was reported. But some people might think that the word threaten is emotional language intended to scare people. So if, I agree with you that this could be somewhat biased, but also objective. It is somewhere on a spectrum between those two. Okay, so out of these two, is one of them more biased, or are neither of them biased?
A is more biased because it goes a little further. It says offer a little detail. It's a little bit more of a charged language, I guess. New York Post simply states what he did, while Axios says adds a little bit more than what he does.
Right. It seems like that offers little detail is a little bit of a dig. Although as you read the story, they do lay out the facts of the plan and compare it to the existing Affordable Care Act. So they're giving a little context to why they say little detail, and they provide some perspective. So I think if we had to pick one, I agree. I think it would be A would be more biased, but definitely not that bad when taken in context with the rest of the article. I liked that these two really show how much of a spectrum bias can be, right? It's not A or B sometimes. There's a lot more context to the conversation.
And also it just shows that headlines can be biased, the article cannot be.
Right, exactly. Like they want you to click on it, but then once you get there, it's not as biased as you think, which is really interesting. All right, so that's all we've got. But just a few key points. So many of the stories that we read today didn't tell the whole story. So we needed to read across the spectrum to see all of the facts. And we need a diverse news diet, quote unquote, to avoid only seeing those one or two sources. And when we only use social media to bring those stories to us, we're really allowing our news to go through these filters and algorithms of what our friends share and what we're liking. So we really need to be aware of what we're following and sometimes seek out different news. So one thing that I did a little while ago was a news evaluation. I reviewed what sources I follow. Are they mostly across the spectrum? Are they objective? Am I skewed in one direction? And then can you use platforms to seek out news more easily? So on Twitter, you can create a news list or multiple lists of news so that you can eliminate all the other tweets that are going on and just focus on news when you want to. You can make centered news appear, or more objective news appear first in your Facebook feed. Are there other ways that we can think of that we can use social media more strategically?
There's a trick, like sort of making a side Twitter that follows nothing but news sources.
Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. Yeah, I was trying to think of ways for like, I guess for YouTube too, you can create playlists or subscribe to certain things, and likes. If you like a broad spectrum of things, you'll hopefully get a broad spectrum of things in your algorithm as opposed to just a few. All right, so any questions? Things that you feel like you learned today?
I learned that bias is on a spectrum and it's not so black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, the most important thing. Awesome. Well, thanks so much for joining today.